You already know Disney's in a world of hurt, but actually it's much worse than you think. Much worse.
This isn't about she who will not be named again, is it?
No, this isn't another Kathleen Kennedy rant, although she is a critical part of the equation, and I'll get to her in a bit. No! It's sad that in this, its 100th year, instead of just celebrating, Disney is glaring down the barrel of its biggest existential crisis in their history. It's a perfect storm of issues coming together all at once, but it can basically be boiled down to three things, and we'll tackle the biggest one last, not only because the first two kind of feed into it, but also because it's from a source you're not expecting, but it will blow your mind. The number of publicly traded companies on the New York Stock Exchange is about half of what it was 20 years ago. There are two main reasons for this. One, the mass consolidation of companies, and two, the number of companies that got tired of answering to shareholders and took themselves private again. And it's that second point that's the critical one here, because most of those companies that are still public, they aren't actually companies. Not in the traditional sense anyway, they're just stock plays. I'm sure most of you have experienced this yourselves on some level. An investment entity comes in, puts money into a company, then expects some sort of return in a given time frame, usually around 5 years. What the company actually does as its business is irrelevant. That's why you see news stories involving the CEO of a clothing brand suddenly becoming the CEO of a chain restaurant. Upper management in any large company is essentially interchangeable with any other. They're not experts in any particular field other than wearing a suit.
They're like their own species with their own language and vocabulary of useless buzzwords.
Their game plan, operations-wise, is usually the same. Cut a whole bunch of staff, reduce overhead, try to create value in the company by stripping it down and running lean. Sometimes they might even buy a competing company just so they can tell the shareholders they expanded the footprint of the brand, but there is almost never any actual organic growth.
But why?
Well, to be perfectly honest, because deep down inside they have no clue what they're doing. At a certain level, they're very much aware of this, and consequently, they're deeply insecure when it comes to taking chances or risks.
As they should be. If you boldly buy a company and pretend you know what you're doing, suddenly you're out $44 billion.
Right you are, Doge. It's common sense. If the management at Company A was an expert at making widgets, they would be able to organically grow the company with complete and utter confidence. Or at least hire and trust people who do know to do it for them. But they can't, so they don't. But the main problem with this is that even though they think they're playing it safe, it's an inevitable, slow, painful train to failure over the long term. This is just part of what's happening right now with Disney. They're operating out of fear of risk, fear of taking chances. This is why we've seen an overwhelming amount of these live-action remakes. They can easily sell it to the shareholders that it's a safe bet on getting a solid return on their investment.
But that slow, painful train to failure has led to a drop of 70% at the box office since 2019.
Indeed, all of Hollywood is like this right now. Everything has been a sequel, remake, or reboot, which leads to problem number 2. Yes, Kathleen Kennedy's feminist agenda and misandry come into play here, and her systematic destruction of turning male heroes into grumpy, broken men, but the issue is actually much, much larger than that. For the last several decades, companies have really latched onto the statistic that women are the primary spenders in a household, regardless of who makes what money or how much. In fact, women drive between 70 and 80% of consumer spending. As a consequence, companies across the board have been pivoting absolutely everything to target that demographic, whether it makes sense or not. You ever wonder why cars are all looking the same and sports cars are almost non-existent? Targeting a female demographic.
Even the Mustang was turned into an SUV.
I challenge you, watch the average commercial and ask yourself who they're talking to. I came face to face with this phenomenon myself years ago when I worked in radio.
Don't touch that dial.
I was at a station that wanted to compete with the dominant classic rock station in town that was very male skewing. My corporately owned radio station was owned by suits who didn't know radio, and they wanted to go after women for precisely this reason. They're the ones who spend the money, so that should be appealing to our advertisers. We called ourselves Rock and Roll Classics, and our poor salespeople were tasked with going out to our potential advertisers and telling them that Rock and Roll Classics was different than classic rock and roll. With a straight face. Sure, Kennedy clearly said out loud she had a feminist agenda, but it's more than that, because one of those things she tried to do was reframe Star Wars into something they thought would be appealing to women.
But just like the WNBA, the women didn't show up.
Right, Giardo, not only did women not respond, but they alienated the male audiences that IPs like Star Wars and Indiana Jones had built. Here is your wake-up call, Kathy. No one cares what gender the hero is. What people want is a good story, and that means following the hero's journey. There are books about this. The character must have an arc. They must learn and grow so we can root for them and connect with them. Does anyone care that Ripley is female? No, it's a well-written story, and people of both genders root for her. Does anybody care that Sarah Connor is a female? No, it's a well-written story, and people of both genders root for her. Does anybody care that Rey is a female? No. The issue is that it's a poorly written story with no character arc, no growth. She's just automatically awesome at everything, and people of both genders do not root for her. It's about the story, not the gender of the protagonist. Kennedy's repeated attempts at blaming the fans for her failures is like a YouTuber trying to blame the algorithm. That's not how this works. She is certainly getting her comeuppance after lying repeatedly to George's face.
Unwilling to turn it over to Kathy to do more. I have story treatments of 7, 8, and 9 and a bunch of other movies, and obviously we have hundreds of books and comics and everything you could possibly imagine. So, I sort of moved that treasure trove of stories and various things to Kathy, and I have complete confidence that she's going to take them and make great movies. I'm doing this so that the films will have a longer life, and so that more fans and people can enjoy them into the future. It's a very big universe I've created, and there's a lot of stories that are sitting in there.
The main thing is to protect these characters, make sure that they still continue to live in the way that you created them, and that the universe of Star Wars continues to grow.
I just said that I would back her up, and I would be there if, and especially helping with the script and making sure the script sort of, there's a lot of blank spots in the story treatment that hopefully we can fill in. And
I think the incredible thing about George is, this is not like a series of books like Harry Potter where you've already got a template of what the stories might be. These are original stories and original ideas that come out of a world that essentially is in George's head. So the beauty of the collaboration that can continue is as we work our way through these scripts, if we're sitting and saying, I wonder if this character can do that, or does this make sense within the rules of Star Wars? That really, he's the keeper of the flame when it comes to that.
It's the same thing with the first 3 films. That's all my job is to be the keeper of the flame.
Speaking of George, this leads us to number 3, the biggie. You've no doubt heard about the boatload of rumors going on at Lucasfilm in the aftermath of Indy 5. Kathy reportedly on some sort of leave, her work email not working, and the possibility of Lucasfilm itself being up for sale. One of those rumors is that George himself might be buying it back. Is that likely? I doubt it. While Disney is going to be desperately in need of money very soon, and I'll get to that in a moment, they would sell it back to him at a loss, meaning less than the $4 billion they paid for it. Plus, they'd have to continue to pay licensing costs to all the rides in the parks, or the larger costs of tearing all these rides out. The only way I see that happening is if there was a clause in the initial sale documents that gave George the right of first refusal if Disney decided to sell it off. Unfortunately, I think we have to chalk this one up to romantic fantasy. If a sale is going to happen at all, I think the much more likely scenario is the Saudis. Since oil is becoming less of a thing, they've had to diversify, and they've been buying up weird stuff all over the place, including mobile game publisher Scopely, who owns Star Trek Fleet Command and Marvel Strike Force.
And don't forget the golf thing.
Right? Now, a buyer like that would have no problem overpaying for something like Lucasfilm as a cool little trinket to add to their collection, maybe paying Disney twice what they gave George, and that will be money from their couch cushion. As a publicly held company, Bob Iger would have a fiduciary responsibility to not only entertain such an offer, but he might actually be forced to take it.
Especially when it comes to the mystery figure in the thumbnail.
Especially when it comes to the mysterious mystery figure in the thumbnail.
Once upon a time, 3 of the big 4 networks came together to create this one-stop shop for the broadcast program.
From Hulu. ABC is owned by Disney, 20th Century owned Fox, and Comcast has NBC. CBS was not a part of it. As we all know, Disney bought Fox, so suddenly they own 2/3 of Hulu. And apparently there is language in the contract that calls for Disney to buy Comcast out of their share of the streaming service. It was at Comcast's discretion on pulling the trigger on that, and the trigger had been pulled. All that remains is how much and when. The vague part of the when is going to be in 2024 because the trigger was pulled. The specific part is yet to be determined. How much is going to be the big issue, as a third-party arbitrator is going to have to come in to establish the value. Comcast is saying that evaluation is $70 billion. That's obviously a check Disney couldn't write even on a good day. Granted, the final amount will no doubt be lower, but it's been a long time since Disney has had a good day, and the amount will be too high regardless of what it ends up being. Their CFO is out. Their chief diversity officer is out. 7,000 others have been laid off. Production budgets have been slashed. Shows have been canceled. Shows like Willow have been pulled off of Disney Plus to use as a tax write-off, along with at least 12 other movies.
Don't forget, Disney Plus lost 4 million subs.
Things are so dark, they extended Bob Iger's contract another 2 years. This for a guy who has tried to step down like 4 or 5 times in the last decade and can't seem to get away. But with what Disney faces on the horizon, who else would have wanted the job because it does not look good?
But I look good.
Yeah, yes, you do. Stay fresh, cheese bags.